Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to our December 1st meeting of the City of Everett Planning Commission. And we'll start with our roll call.
Chair Stewart.
Here.
Commissioner Holland.
Here.
Commissioner Sand.
Here.
Commissioner Tisdall.
Here.
Commissioner Beck.
Here.
All right, and next we have approval of our meeting minutes from October 20th. As you'll recollect, we were not able to meet November 17th. That was the night of the big windstorm and power outage. So in your meeting packets in the November package, you should have had the October 20th, 2015 meeting minutes. Has everybody had a chance to review these minutes? Any comments, changes to them? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes.
I move to approve the minutes of October 20th.
Second.
Commissioner Beck.
Yes.
Commissioner Tisdall.
Yes.
Commissioner Sand.
Yes.
Commissioner Holland.
Yes.
Chair Stewart.
All right, the meeting minutes are approved. And next are reports from members. We'll start with Commissioner Beck.
No reports.
No report.
No report.
No report tonight.
And I guess I have a short report. So 2 nights after the windstorm, so November 19th, the City of Everett Tree Committee convened, and the Parks Department were still in the process of assessing damage to trees and other things in the parks and public right-of-way. But they said there were hundreds of trees damaged or down. So, and that's my report. So next, are there any staff comments?
Yes, Alan Giffen, Planning Director, and I do have a number of comments. First of all, I'd like to call David Stallheim up just to will stand and be introduced. David is our new long-range planning manager. He's on his second day of the job here, and he comes to us from the city of Bellingham, where he was a housing manager of their housing program up there, and he's got good experience in a number of jurisdictions as a planning director, and will lead up our long-range planning group. So he'll be spending many evenings with you in the future.
Great.
David, is there anything you'd like to say?
Forward to it.
All right, thank you. My second item is this is our chairperson's final meeting as a planning commissioner. Commissioner Stewart, Chairperson Stewart, has decided to hire on with the city of Everett. So tomorrow she becomes a staff person. This is her last official meeting as a planning commissioner, and want to thank her for her service as a planning commissioner in this past year, and especially as chairperson, doing an outstanding job as chair, and look forward to having you on staff. Work starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow, Karen.
Okay. I'll make sure I'm not late. Thank you very much. Yeah, I will be serving as the environmental planner on Ellen's team, so I'm sure I'll appear before the Planning Commission on various occasions. So I look forward to that. But I also wanted to take a moment just to thank my fellow commissioners for all your good, hard work, particularly this last year as we were preparing the comprehensive plan update, all the extra meetings, and I thought it was all very well received, and I know the City Council really appreciated our hard work and recommendations. So it's been an honor serving with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My next item, there is next week, the 8th of December, the mayor's reception for boards and commissions. That will be from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the Edward Hanson Conference Center at the Xfinity Arena. That's a good turnout, and all the boards and commissions for the city are invited to attend that, and the mayor will do the usual honors of thanking all of you and other board members for their service. Our next meeting We don't have the topics nailed down yet, but since it, with the holidays coming up, we'll just skip our third Tuesday of December and won't have a meeting that evening, but we'll look forward to probably have a meeting then on Tuesday, January 5th. And then one last thing, over the course of the past year, we've had a number of discussions about the definition of family. And Commissioner Beck did send me an email that, with a link about a federal court case in Connecticut, I believe it was, that is a very similar situation where the local zoning ordinance defines family based upon either related members or, if they're not related, a certain number of adults. And so that, similar to our definition, is being challenged in federal court for a town back in Connecticut. And so we'll be watching that one probably before we bring anything back to the commission in the coming year on that definition or that code amendment. So with that, that concludes all of my remarks until you get to the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Next would be an opportunity for members of the audience who would like to address the Planning Commission tonight, not on one of our 3 items on the agenda, but if you have some other comments you'd like to make, now's your opportunity to approach the podium. Not seeing anybody taking advantage of that. So we do have 3 items on our agenda tonight, and I think we're ready for our first one, which will be a briefing on the Grand Avenue Park Bridge.
And Jim Miller from the Public Works Department will be giving a presentation on this one.
So normally the utilities division within Public Works doesn't build bridges, but this is a rather unique situation where we needed a bridge. And I thought I was been asked just give you an overview. The bridge is close to 90% design. We're supposed to get it as a Christmas present, 90% design. It all started with flooding problems in North Everett. This first graphic gives an idea of flooding. It says it's basement flooding, but if you look real close, there aren't really basements there. But there was the best picture we could find of what appeared to be somebody getting flooded out. What's happened in the last, let's say maybe the last 5 years, we've found that storms are increasing in intensity and in frequency. So you probably heard the term like a 100-year storm, and that's all based on probability and hydrology. But when you start having a couple of those in a 5 or 10-year period, you have to scratch your head and say, well, wait a minute. Those aren't 100 years apart now. That doesn't mean it necessarily would be. But long and the short of it, we have a combined system in North Everett, which means both our stormwater and the sewage goes into one system. Started over 100 years ago. And some might wonder, well, why'd they do that? You know? Well, I'm sure economics was part of it. I mean, building 2 systems maybe would have been a nice thing to do, but virtually twice as expensive. And Everett's not the only city. There are many cities across the nation, and closest one actually being Seattle. So we've had to deal with these increased storm intensities with a combined system. And the way we've approached it is by trying to separate out as much stormwater as we could, particularly if the area is near a water body, either the sound or the river. And so in this particular case, we're looking at right off of Grand Avenue, the cliff if you will, that goes from Grand Avenue on the northwest edge of Everett down to the water. We've got pipes going down that cliff, and they're not in the best of shape, particularly when you have slides that tend to take the earth out from under them or around them. But that's where our combined sewer overflows go. Those occur when the system just becomes overwhelmed. So as far as the purpose for this particular bridge, we looked at tunneling, and as you probably know from stories of Bertha, tunneling is kind of a problematic. Sometimes it works, sometimes not, and can be fairly expensive. And so we looked at the trade-offs. They're actually relatively close. Go with a tunnel or a bridge. And so we went the bridge route, and the reasons being, first, to convey the stormwater from what we call Sewer M, which is it's under construction right now up in the Grand neighborhood, roughly from 10th to 15th, and from Grand over to Colby. Also to convey sewage in 2 overflow outfalls that already exist there. You saw 2 of them in the picture. Thirdly, there's a force main at the bottom that gets pumped water that goes, pumped sewage, I should say, to get it up to the top of the hill. And fourth, possible future water main crossing. So we have 4 potential uses of the bridge. And then the additional benefit was connecting pedestrians to the waterfront. There's kind of a bonus, if you will. So, so the location is, the bridge would be right off of an extension of 16th. And go down to the water. It will convey, and the color is kind of, the blue represents stormwater, the red represents combined sewage, the kind of purple represents force main, which would have sewage in it going the other direction, going up the hill. And we didn't put the water line, potential future water line. We're not intending to put that on the bridge initially. But anyway, the bridge essentially goes from the bluff up here. It's as you'll see a little clearer in a minute. It's right at the end of Grand Avenue Park, which runs down Grand for several blocks and lands down in essentially what is now just a parking lot. Lombardi's is just off in here. This kind of gives you a little different perspective, and I see we didn't quite get color coordinated because the red stays the same. That's the combined sewer overflow. However, what was blue in the previous graphic has turned to green, I see, and that would be conveying stormwater to an existing outfall right here. So that kind of gives you some perspective of the bridge and what it's about. The budget, we're looking 13.6 million, majority of it being from utilities. And a pedestrian portion, we're covering, we have a federal grant for 2 million, general fund 600,000, some mitigation funding for 300,000, and then the utilities picking up the majority of the budget. As far as the schedule, as indicated, we're designed. We hope to have it essentially completed in March as far as the design. Permitting, however, is liable to run quite a bit later. It all depends on how many agencies get involved and how they're going to view what we are conveying over the bridge. We're not changing a whole lot, but we still haven't got a determination of how long that could take. So it could go as late as 2016. If it does, the construction period would be into 16 through through the end of 17. We're looking at about a 14-month construction. If we can start earlier, we will, and we kind of hope we can, but again, we don't want to be over-optimistic. That's another aerial view with Grand Avenue Park being here and the proposed bridge being here. So Grand Avenue Park, these two views are looking toward the north with the trail kind of right along the ridge. This is actually looking kind of in a southwesterly direction, notable there being the cherry trees that are line Grand. This is looking at one block of Grand Avenue Park, and we would be essentially taking off at this elbow in the trail. 16th is over here, and originally we were going to stay essentially within the right-of-way of 16th and shoot out there, but in order to integrate it better with the park, it was decided it'd be best to actually move the takeoff point to this kind of angle here. And you could always see there some of the construction work up there for what we call sewer M, namely to put in a separate storm system and replace the sewers, already has, of course, impacted some here. But the total impact of the bridge might run over to here, trying to preserve particularly the larger trees in the park. This shows kind of the park entrance and what it might look like. Of course, we have to have rails, and we're trying to keep those low. I think they have to be at least 10 feet once you go over the railroad. This goes over the railroad as well as West Marine View Drive. This then would be as you go onto the bridge. The bridge, in order to avoid having a lot of piling and an elevator on the park side, they devised, essentially, it's like a switchback. So it's like a ramp, it'll go out, it'll switch back, and then go across to the other side, keeping a minimum of the 5% for ADA compliance. And if you would rather not go on the ramp, there is actually stairs that you also could go down, take a shortcut, if you will. This gets a little more of a close-up. So this ramp, it comes out, it then doubles back into the bank, and then you turn and you continue on this way to the elevator shaft, and then it's down the shaft. If you want to use the elevator, there also will be a wraparound stairway that you could walk down at this end with the landing here, essentially at street level. This would be the tower, we call the elevator tower. The elevator's in this portion, and then the pipes that come across underneath the pedestrian walkway, those would be essentially down a big shaft here and into the ground, into the street before they then continue on. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Any questions or comments you might
So
have?
there would need to be tunneling under the roadway to get to the water's edge, right? From,
It most likely would be open cut, because they're not that, the pipes aren't that deep.
other questions from commissioners?
Who else have you, neighborhood, who else is seeing this?
We, last count, I think we have 10 presentations in total. We started with City Council. Last week, I presented to the Historical Commission, the Tree Committee. I don't know if, Karen, you were there. Next week, it's the Park Board, and then there's a number of neighborhood groups that have asked and are scheduled for the presentation.
Okay, I assume you're coordinating with the port? of Everett on this too?
Yes, oh yes. The port, of course, with their marina project, we're very interested in this. They want us to minimize the footprint, which we've attempted to do. But they are very enthused about the linkage, of course, with their marina project and public access to the waterfront off of the hill. And of course, we have to actually get property from them where we're landing. And so, yes, we've got to coordinate with them, the PUD, who have wires that we have to get between. There's high voltage wires, low voltage wires. There's gas company. Of course, there's a railroad. We have to get air rights, working with the park department. So a lot of folks involved in this.
And will you have restrictions working above the railroad, like I know the city had with the bridge on Broadway?
Right. We are quite a bit higher than the Broadway Bridge, so that the clearance there has not been an issue. The biggest challenge has been with the high voltage wires, probably more so during construction, trying to assemble this, which one proposal has it assembled in 3 pieces with some temporary piers until it gets assembled. But they do come fairly close to the overhead wires. The lower wires are going to be rerouted down below. Those which includes I think Frontier and one of the cable companies as well as the PUD. Those will route down underground to get under the bridge.
And then in bringing the big pieces to assemble on the site, what will be the route? Can you barge them in on the water, or?
Well, that will be determined by the contractor. We do have a constructability expert evaluating this, and that's one route he's looked at. He's also looked at bringing them in by rail and bringing them in by highway.
All right. Well, thank you for your presentation. Are there any members of the public who would like to make comments on this particular item? This isn't a public hearing, but there's an opportunity if there's public questions. Seeing none, then I guess we'll move on to item number 2. And this is actual workshop on amendments to the zoning code to allow community centers through the special property use permit process.
Good evening, Niels Tegeson, Planning Department. So before I go into the presentation, I'd like to just briefly try to clear up some confusion that may have been out there. I've had a number of questions in the last week. Agenda item number 2 and 3, the first one being for community centers and the second one for adaptive reuse of churches in residential zones, are 2 completely separate processes and 2 completely separate requests. I think some of the confusion that may have arisen is because they both deal with changes, proposed changes to the special property use regulations, but they are 2 completely separate processes or requests. So in tonight's community center workshop, I'll go over a brief background, look at some proposed definitions, along with a few options for use matrix, look at the future actions that would be required to move this forward, and then open it up for discussion and feedback. And even though I have it as the last topic point, if there's any questions, please interject throughout the discussion. So a request was made to the city for a text amendment to the permitted uses in residential zones to allow community centers through the special property use permit. And Planning Commission back on October 20th agreed to initiate this consideration with an amendment that would be considered community-wide, not just within residential zones. We looked at a number of jurisdictions locally that had similar review processes and definitions. Very few had both definitions for community centers along with regulations for them. Some either had definitions and no regulations back and forth. Those that did have, those jurisdictions that did have something on the books for how to regulate community centers handled them under a conditional use process. There didn't seem to be any that had specific criteria for the community centers. They handled it through conditions upon approval for any requirements. Currently, we do not have any specific definition for community center, and it is an unlisted use in our use matrix. Where there is sort of a back door into permitting public service or for community centers is within the definition for public service use in buildings. Within that definition, it says a public service use or building is a use or building supported with services provided by a public agency. And that term includes fire stations, police precincts or substations, community centers, and other public service uses. So if there were a proposal, it'd be limited to only a public entity like Snohomish County. If Snohomish County wanted to come in and propose a community center in one of our neighborhoods, we have that process available for all the residential zones. But if a private entity or a commercial or a nonprofit wanted to, we don't have that currently. And I guess just to, if there's any confusion with nomenclature, if talking about community centers, neighborhood centers, things of that nature are all what we're calling community center. And so when we, excuse me, when we think of what a community center can be, there are a multitude of uses and services that can be provided. There can be a place for public meetings to be held, a place where the community members can rent out spaces for private parties, birthday parties, weddings. There can be a component of educational and recreational opportunities, access to some health and wellness services, childcare services, classrooms. It can also be a great asset in case there's a natural or man-made emergency, catastrophe for emergency management to act as a triage center or a rallying sort for the community. The physical setting or makeup of what a community center can be generally is falls within three categories. It can be designed and built as a community center, reuse of a public or commercial building, great sustainability issue if we have buildings that are falling in disrepair or unuse. And a way to get out of blight is through this option, and also as a secondary use to a primary use. So, for example, churches and schools have historically acted as community centers in the past. Ownership and organization generally falls within four categories, and I'll just briefly talk about this because it may impact the next discussion topic, which is our definitions. But a community center can either be community-owned and run. It can be government-owned, so a public entity. It can be sponsored by, say, a wealthy benefactor or benefactress, or it can be a commercial for-profit. So within the definitions, I won't necessarily go through this verbatim. They are in the packet if you want to read them verbatim, but generally the first definition calls out a community center as being an institution as well as being a nonprofit organization.
Could I ask one question real quick, like on your previous slide? Could you give an example of the commercial ownership for a community center? I'm just trying to kind of clarify in my mind what a commercial community center would be.
Full community center. I don't
mean to put you on the spot here, but I was just trying to think, what would a commercial use for a community center be? Because I think it's important we understand that in terms of a definition.
Good question. And commercial came in with a discussion of, for example, for-profit, and the discussion of nonprofit versus for-profit community centers.
And like, would a Bally's be considered a community center? I mean, because the service they offer is for, so that's just what I'm struggling with right now is, why would anybody commercially own a community center? So I just was looking for an example, and if you can't, no worries.
Yeah, I don't have an exact example, but I would say Bally's in our, how we would review a Bally's is more as a fitness center.
The reason why I'm asking is, if we do create a definition, we might be mindful of, whether it's a nonprofit use, whether it's a public use, just as we go through and try to clearly articulate what we consider community centers. And I can't think of a commercial use. I mean, but I'm sure there might be one.
Right, and that's one of the key reasons why I put this up here for discussions for our definitions, because sometimes one simple word can be a huge legal debate, right? And again, the commercial entity came in with discussions of what is a profit versus a nonprofit, and that can be very confusing. And yeah. So again, I have all the definition or the possible four options for definitions that we've crafted up here, but again, I won't read them verbatim, but I'll just talk about the slight differences that are between the four. And again, option one specifically states it's an institution and that it's a nonprofit organization. Option two is more basic and basically saying that it's a building and or structure, but it does say that it's stated by a public agency or a nonprofit. Option three is fairly broad. We may have got this from piecing together from dictionaries like Oxford and dictionary.com. But it is fairly broad, and it doesn't stipulate an organization or ownership component. And option four is the most verbose, partly because the second half we go into delineating what sort of uses and activities could be there. For example, community rooms and fitness centers, classrooms, health and wellness. So within these options, we can piecemeal, we can craft based on debate and input. With all the proposed definitions, we'd like to suggest a potential disclaimer towards the end that stipulates what is not considered to be part of that definition. So for example, outright clinics and medical-related activities such as that, or government administrative offices would not be considered a community center. We have already processes in our land use tables that allow for these uses as primary uses. This may be difficult to see on the table, but it is in the handout in the packet. Just to orientate everybody, on the top are the various zones within the city. And then the community center down here, the Roman numerals 3 versus 1 delineates whether or not, or what review process that would fall in for those zones. As you can see, for A1, which stands for agriculture, and our residential zones, the RS through the R5, fall under a review process 3, which is a rather lengthy review. It goes through public notice with a 500-foot notification to properties near the proposed property. And then that determination, or once the public review is complete, the staff write up a staff report with a recommendation to the hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner makes that determination. A review process 1 does not require public notification, and it's an administrative review decision by the director. This option that we have as option 1 is the same as existing public service uses buildings that's on the books currently. So again, if Snohomish County wanted to come in, as an example, and build a community center, this is the review process that they would go through. Option 2 is similar to existing uses such as health clubs or fitness clubs such as ballets and entertainment centers. So we do not currently allow those uses in residential zones. For most of the business commercial zones, we review that as a review process 1, administrative review. And then option 3 would be similar to option 1, again, allowing the community center use throughout all the zones. Again, a higher review through the residential uses, administrative review for the business and commercial zones. It would have specific review criteria for special property uses along with the general evaluation. And I'll go into the criteria in a little bit here. The general SPU criteria, or special property use criteria, are required for all proposals. If an applicant came in, they would have to submit a narrative to the city that explains how they meet all these criteria and how any impacts, or document what is existing and what is proposed, and for example, traffic impacts, what's existing and what's proposed, discuss the signage, any landscaping that would be proposed as well. Potential specific criteria with option number 3 were crafted most on existing regulations, for example, the churches and schools that we have under their specific criteria, we crafted to be similar for the community centers. So there would be setbacks, adjacencies for collector, or how close they could be to a collector or arterial street, where the connection for parking would be located, how closely the structures could be to adjacent residential properties. In this particular case, I believe this was taken from our school, so we have a setback of 25 feet, and buildings can be up to 25 feet with a 25-foot height. And then with each foot that the building is set back, they can go up an additional foot. So, for example, if a building was set back 30 feet, the structure could be 30 feet high. That doesn't necessarily state a maximum height, so that might want to be stipulated. If we don't go that route, another option would be to allow for the height to be maximum permitted for that zone. So, for example, a single-family R2 zone has a maximum height of 28 feet. However, under the review process, we may allow for a greater height if the additional height is required for a functional need, and that height is the lowest that would be required to accommodate that. At this time, we're not proposing any changes to the development standards table for either landscaping or signage. Within the standards, we have a call out for landscaping for residential uses, and then also those for permitted non-residential uses, as well as signage. And so for the landscaping, the two different options that they have would be to have landscaping at 10 feet in width, along with a solid fence, be it masonry or wood, along with shrubs and evergreen, or they can go with a 15-foot width without a fence. Signage for approved non-residential uses allow for one freestanding sign per street frontage. That would be up to 10 feet in height and up to 32 square feet in area. And they're also allowed one wall sign per facade up to 40 square feet. So we're not proposing any changes there. And parking, we would suggest follow what's called out in section 34.03, which requires a parking study to be reviewed by the traffic engineer and the director to determine the most appropriate minimum parking standards. So with that, if there's enough information to get feedback and direction, we can either have a second potential workshop or move forward and craft language to go through a public review process and environmental review. Once that's complete, we could hold a public hearing with Planning Commission where there'd be a recommendation to City Council. So at this time, if there's any discussion or feedback.
Okay, any questions from the commission? Commissioner Sand?
Yes. The page that we have in our packet that talks about the possible uses, potential definitions, and then the options for the review process. Have you selected from these various potential elements of these options to draft this proposal? Or is this something that the Planning Commission is supposed to do, is to identify what we think the possible uses should be, and then to determine what the potential definition should be, and then finally determine which review process we think is appropriate? Or has that been done for us already?
It has not been done as a recommendation. We've given you some options here, and what we would like is to hear what the commission thinks about some of these uses or the appropriate review processes. And with that direction, we could, if the commission pleases, go to drafting up some regulations, circulate that through a SEPA environmental review for the public and other city agencies to comment on, the city departments to comment on. And we could potentially have a decision meeting at some point when we're done with that SEPA process where the commission could make a decision. Or if you're not to that point where you're comfortable yet, until you see language that's been drafted based upon your feedback tonight, we could hold a workshop in January, probably that meeting of the 5th. We could come back with something that you could take a look at and decide if that's something you would like us to circulate through the SEPA environmental review process.
If I could ask for if these examples would apply for these definitions. We understand that there's a proposal for the Y to move out to South Everett. So that kind of triggered this whole discussion. So if the Boys and Girls Club wanted to build a new facility within the city, would these provisions apply to that application?
Yes.
Okay. How about if the North Everett Little League wanted to build a new ball field and a large building for meetings and batting cages and things like that? Would that apply?
Potentially it could, again, depending on how we specifically define the use, so that it would include, for example, of the Little League example, a nonprofit youth sports organization.
Right.
That could benefit from an amendment like this in a residential zone, as opposed to, say, a commercial outdoor recreational activity. This is not Little League would not be a commercial venture as opposed to something like a private golf course or something like that.
Okay. And then the last one is, if the Good Sam Trailer Club wanted to build a facility someplace in Everett where they could all meet and have rallies and have club meetings and things like that, kind of an assembly location, would that apply to this as well, or?
It's not our thought that something like that would be allowed as a community center. If they were parking RVs in a campground type of a thing, it would be more of a recreational campground, would be the principal land use. If this was a club that just wanted to meet in a, if I'm understanding a Good Sam Club, if it was a club that just wanted to have a meeting hall within a residential zone, then again, it could be, well, we do have a private club land use category within our code, and I don't believe those would be allowed in residential zones, if I'm, that's correct. So again, I may not be understanding the question about a Good Sam Club, but.
Well, I think the point is, for me anyway, is because we're talking about introducing some activities into the residential neighborhood that typically wouldn't be there, we would need to be, I think, fairly clear in our definition of what could be there and what not. And even for those that might be permitted in some fashion, it would make sense to have a strong review process or a special use permit process behind it to be able to evaluate things, because the definitions appear to me to be very general.
Right, and the intent here is to just get a feel from the commission as to what type of things would be considered appropriate within that definition and potentially within a residential zone. And again, understanding that we're suggesting here, without making a recommendation at this time, that something like this should be a special property use type of review process, 3 hearing, examine, and review in any residential zone.
Thank you.
Other questions? So, Steph, you got a question?
Yeah, just I guess a couple comments.
Okay.
So, since you're looking for feedback on these different options, me personally, just looking through the activities and possible uses for community centers, I didn't have any issues with any of those. As far as the definitions were concerned, to me, number 4 seemed reasonable with the disclaimer, that you were proposing for all 4 of those potential definitions. I'd also be in favor of option 3, which requires the special use provision as well as the additional conditions that you referred to in 41.150 D2D. And then just a couple of comments on the for those special SPU criteria. And this one's related to the heights. And you talked about a maximum height where you currently don't have that. It's just you get an extra foot for an extra foot of setback. But I'd like to know if we have anything in the code related to preserving any view corridors or anything like that would cap the height of any new use that's going to be in our zone, where we potentially have some view corridors that could be impacted there, as well as any, not necessarily just view corridors, but any solar corridors or anything like that would block out sunlight. That would be something that I think would be needed in a residential neighborhood. And then lastly, the signage. 10-foot sign to me sounds like a monument-type sign, which is currently in your code. Is there any additional design criteria for those that would require, a decorative base or anything like that would match kind of the architectural character of the facility that's actually constructed or the facilities that's existing?
Not currently, no.
Well, I think it would be good to have some kind of design criteria for a residential neighborhood, that any signage would be, coincide with the decorative nature of the building itself as well, so. And then would there be any additional building design criteria to make sure it fits in with the neighborhood too, is something that I didn't see in here that,
That would probably fall under the existing criteria, item number 5, compatibility of proposed structures and improvements, and this could also go to that view issue and solar access. Improvements with surrounding properties, including the size, height, location, setback, and arrangements of all proposed buildings and facilities, especially as they relate to light and shadow impacts on more sensitive land uses and less intensive zones. So I think that covers it all fairly generally
right?
without getting into specific design criteria.
Thank you.
That's my one comment is, I think the special use kind of covers things generally on an evaluation criteria that, you know, sites are unique. And sometimes when we get overly prescriptive, it makes it difficult to meet those prescriptions. So by the nature of a special use, people can be a little bit more creative in addressing those concerns. So even the landscaping, I'm kind of like, you know, there might be some unique properties out there. You definitely want to have landscaping, but by prescribing what the landscaping has to be, can the site meet that? So that's my one concern on getting prescriptive.
Any other comments or feedback? How about the potential definitions? So we have the 4 of them. Do the commissioners feel that, I think we heard Commissioner Holland was advocating 4, perhaps? That seems to have a little bit more definition to it. It's longer.
I agree with 4 as well.
Again, I'm kind of the generalist here. I kind of like number 2, because that really gets to it being a nonprofit or a public service building and being predominantly for cultural. We don't want to get too definitive because we, you know, again, the special use would consider that, and the proponent would have to state what the cultural purpose is. And it doesn't put too much of a box on it. Educational, non-motorized recreation, or social purposes, just so we don't get a racetrack in a residential area.
Okay. And then in terms of the review processes, option number 2, I was maybe confused about a little bit because community center was not specified for the residential zones, if I'm understanding that right.
Correct. So we put this in there in case it was felt that community centers would have been too much of an impact towards residential uses. So this option is similar to what we have, for example, fitness centers or other recreational facilities.
Okay. But I'm assuming if somehow we would need to specify what the review process would be for a community center in a residentially zoned area, right?
If the decision was to allow for community centers in residential zones,
Okay.
option 2 would not make that allowable.
Okay. So how does the commissioner view that? I mean, I'm assuming that in this case, the applicant, this wouldn't meet.
This would eliminate the Y from being placed
Right.
in, so I would not consider option 2.
Okay.
But I do have a quick question regarding option 1 and option 3, and the only differences that I really see are that Option 3 is notated, and I know you explained this earlier, so I apologize. But am I correct, the only difference is 72, option 3 kind of has citations associated with it for further information on what to comply with?
Correct. So that 72 would be a footnote that would refer an applicant to a subsection that we're proposing would be 41150D2D, which currently doesn't exist, but would be a specific criteria for community centers.
Okay, okay.
That's what that 72 footnote would be. Option 1 would just be, it would be a special property use, but it'd be only under the general criteria.
Right. So again, I would probably lean more towards option 1 to try to create as much opportunity for creativity and not be as prescriptive, and let the actual special use process, the proponent defend their application, and then have, public comment and consideration, but try to give as much wiggle room for a good application as possible. That's kind of my thoughts on it.
Any other feedback for staff? And then are we thinking we would be ready for the next time we convene on this topic to actually be ready to come up with a recommendation? So do we want staff to prepare something and run it through SEPA prior to coming back to us? Or do we want to help guide a little bit more what would be evaluated through SEPA? Commissioner Sand.
I don't mean to disagree with my fellow commissioner, but I do disagree. And I think that I particularly like option 3 because I can appreciate the fact that there are some better
There's some distinctions for your consideration through the SEPA process at a future Planning Commission discussion or hearing. And so just to use an example, if you had an old church building and maybe it became some form of a business incubator where going through that special property use permit, there are some limits put on the amount of traffic or the amount of activity or hours of operation. Those types of things can address some of the compatibility issues with the surrounding uses. You wouldn't want to open it up to a something that turns into an Everett clinic size reuse of a church building through expansions or continuous add-ons or additions. And so I think we can draft up some language that would create some distinctions, would not circumvent the comp plan and rezoning process for more significant changes, but allow for some flexibility, some opportunity for churches to sell their real estate. And one of the previous comments that we heard a couple of months ago, they had some pretty significant economic use for the property. In some of the cases out in residential single-family zone, if you were going to convert it to high-density housing, then I think we're probably more into a comprehensive plan amendment and rezone. But trying to determine whether or not it's feasible to reuse a building depends upon the use and the economics that use brings and the condition of the building, that staff would not be in a position to make an evaluation.
Thank you.
Quick question, because I think you guys brought up a really important point in terms of the definition